Hi TJers, I am here having a great conversation with Sarah. Now Sarah, tell us who you are and what you do, please.
So thank you, Joe, and it's brilliant to be connecting today. And I am Sara Hope, and I am co-founder of the Conversation Space. And in a nutshell, we help people strengthen their connection in a more human way through conversation.
I think that human way is really interesting in our modern world of technology, videos or virtual connections like we've got now, AI coming through to the fore. It's really important. And one of the things that I know you say is that businesses don't exist, people do. So tell us a bit more of that, because I know that I always hear as well, the business needs this, or let's speak to the organisation, almost like it's a person itself. So tell us a bit more about businesses don't exist, people do.
Yeah, and I think for me that's an invitation for us to think about what we mean when we do use some of those terms, because if I looked and think back to my own experiences and being in an organisation, and I did use those terms, and when I start challenging myself around, well, who is the business and who is the organisation? And people would often say it's so-and-so or it's so-and-so. And I think that's why it's important for us to consider the importance of relationships and how we build that connection with people, as opposed to just assuming everyone knows what we mean about when we talk about the business. And relationships matter. And I think being able to think about that human connection and how we talk to people, how we show up in conversations, you know, things like how we sell, how we influence, how we manage performance, so much of it comes back to the conversation. So we like to keep things simple and talk about helping people connect in a more human way and bringing more humanity to the workplace as well.
I really like that. And it's made me think about things like office politics, because a lot of people, me included, hate office politics. But if you want to get anywhere and want to do anything, you have to play office politics. So how does that come into, positive or negative, into what you're talking about?
I think it's about being able to do things with an intent and being conscious and aware, and being aware of what kind of impact you may or may not have in those conversations, and how does that align to what you're wanting to get out of it. And again, reflecting back on my own experiences and thinking about wanting to get promoted and to move up in terms of career progression, and being aware, as you say, of, and I'm using this in inverted commas, the game that needs to be played in terms of how to manage that successfully. And again, I think so much of it is underpinned by the quality of those relationships, and how we manage them.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we've all had those awful, terrible, cringing work conversations. And we're not going to get into the legal conversations, but just those ones that make you go, really? Tell us more about how those conversations, those negative ones, impact on relationships and about basically the running of a business.
I think they're absolutely key. I think they're absolutely key. And it's one of, you know, we all have this wonderful game changer at our disposal in terms of how we talk to people. And what we're noticing now in society, I think, is conversation is becoming more polarized. And I think unless we start to pay attention to this game changer that we all have and do things with more awareness, we're at risk of people avoiding talking to each other. You know, there's a wonderful piece of research from Corn Ferry that's come out recently about the fear that is often underpinning how we connect at work. And I think we need to be paying more attention to it.
So when you say conversation has become polarized, what immediately springs to mind for me is Brexit, Trump, things like kind of the ecological situation that we're all in, aside from, I'm sure, many other smaller kind of topics. Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking, that's like, just don't talk politics and religion and everything will be fine?
I think it's those assumptions that we all as human beings hold about all sorts of different things. And I think from a kind of organizational and leadership perspective, putting aside the kind of Brexit Trump piece for the moment, being able to have those conversations that feel a bit uncomfortable and that feel a bit risky, being willing to go into conversations and saying, I don't know, requires a willingness to be vulnerable and a willingness to sit with that discomfort and to practice thinking it's okay to be in that space and being willing to disagree and to challenge. And we all have, we develop conversational habits over time. And unless I think my invitation is to get people to think about what habits do I hold in my meetings, when I go into meetings, when I have one-to-ones, when I'm talking to my clients. How are those habits helping me and how are they getting in the way? And I think by doing that and noticing and paying attention and thinking about how I could do them differently, opens up a whole range of possibilities that perhaps we might otherwise have not been aware of and not used.
And I think that willingness to be open, to experiment, and to have that confidence to be able to do it is really key. I know, certainly in my work with Training Journal, in the magazine column that I write every month, I've actually got more and more open and vulnerable with that. Where before I would probably be more directly challenging, and that doesn't always come across as well. I've discovered through many experiences, but that vulnerability people really connect with, and I've had a lot of good feedback about that. But you know, I'm of a certain age now where I have almost that kind of confidence to try it. What about, regardless of age, how do we get that confidence to be a little bit more open and vulnerable?
Do you know what? I was thinking back to say it kind of grows with that wisdom comes with age. And I think for me, it does. And I still have lots of those moments of thinking, can I say that? Do I risk doing that? And I think it just takes that ongoing willingness to practice. And I don't think it ever becomes, or for me personally, it doesn't suddenly become easy, but it becomes a little bit more, it's okay to try and it's okay to fail and it's okay to say, do you know what? I did that and it didn't work and I'm going to try it differently next time. And I think having a support network around you as well to help that reflection and to help that that growth in awareness is really, really important. And I certainly feel very privileged to have some fantastic people around me, and particularly my business partner, Emily, where we can have those tough conversations together, and to say, this feels a bit uncomfortable and I still want to go there. Yeah. So I think that practice bit is really key for me, really key.
And we were talking about this just before we were recording the video, weren't we? And with my business partner, I was saying that we used to do a reflection Friday every Friday, and then it got a bit routine and we weren't getting the value out of it. Then we stopped. And only yesterday we had a conversation of, has our focus gone a different way? Are we still both going in the same direction? And what are we observing about each other's behaviour that's making us uncomfortable? And luckily we had the conversation. It helps that we're brother and sister, although not always. That brings with it its own baggage. But being able and willing to have that conversation, saying, this is my reality and my perception, let's come together, was uncomfortable, but really valuable, and actually gave us both motivation in the end.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that. And I think sometimes having those kind of structures, so that time to be able to do that really helps, and I think back to the way our team operates here, and to be able to create the environment to say, let's reflect on this, or I'm going into this situation, can you just help me think it through before I go into it? And I think that environmental piece plays a big part in enabling people to speak up and to say, I need some help with this.
Yeah.
So we, you know, some of the work we do with teams is often about how to create the environment within the team conversations to enable all those voices within the room to be heard. And I think, again, that's becoming more and more critical today when we spend so much time in meetings.
So what are some of those things that a manager needs to consider in the conversations they're having? Perhaps one-to-ones is one area, but also in those team meetings with their team. What are some of the things that managers, some tips you can give to managers or things to think about in how to deal with it?
I think there's a key one around that whole piece around, I'm hesitating because the words and language that people use, I think, is really important. And what I notice now is a desire for people to start to look for more meaning in their work, and for managers and leaders to show more care and empathy and connecting with hearts as well as heads. And I think there's some ways that can help to do that. And I think thinking about how you have those conversations, whether it's a kind of walk and talk and being side by side with someone, so the whole environment piece, I think, is key. I think about, there's a piece about managers and leaders being willing to consider how they demonstrate that vulnerability piece by saying, I don't know, and having more of that kind of coaching approach to conversations, and by asking lots of questions. So I think the whole piece about being curious about the other person, showing that you care, genuinely care, and thinking about the kind of language you use, and being willing to show some of that vulnerability of themselves and saying, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah.
Rather than this kind of mask that we often put on going into a workplace of having to know.
I remember a conversation I had with somebody that I was managing quite a while ago, and they'd basically come to me after a bit of a hard time and sort of said, look, I haven't been working to capacity, I haven't been doing, you know, what I should be doing. Here are some of the personal reasons why. And it wasn't, you know, a big personal issue causing something, but there were all sorts of things. You know, life is complicated, as we know.
Yeah.
And, you know, my initial response, being kind of somebody who likes to fix problems, was, well, why didn't you do this? And you didn't do this. And I told you to do this. And but obviously we can't do that, because that just would have made him go into a shell. But really concentrated on that good stuff of asking the questions and listening. Yeah. And it was about 45 minutes later, I gently said, let's get back to some of those things that we discussed. And that was an entirely different conversation. And again, came out of it, what was a negative, vulnerable, challenging conversation was actually really positive.
Yeah.
And
there was a wonderful lady who was on Radio 4 the other day talking, and she was is a blind and deaf doctor. Oh. And one of the key things that emerged from her being interviewed was how that enabled her to connect in a very different way to patients and think about that empathy piece. And I think we are human beings and we're messy and there's so much to us. And I think by being able to talk about that and bring that in a thoughtful way into the workplace is really, really important. And I don't think it's about kind of oversharing and putting the whole of ourselves out there, but it's thinking about what's appropriate and how will that enable us to connect in a very different way to people around us.
Yeah, and even down to the most simple things of chit chat and conversations to build those connections. It doesn't have to be the deep and meaningful sharing, like you say.
Yeah.
So a last question I have for you is, with all of this information and approach and knowledge, I want to think about how can we use this information as trainers. Perhaps we're designing something, perhaps we're running a training session, whether that's face-to-face or online or however that might be. How can we take some of these things that you're talking about as trainers and facilitators?
firstly, I think there's a piece around how we create the space for people to connect in a more human way, and whether that's thinking about how to set a training session up that enables people to share a little bit more, maybe in a slightly creative way, around who they are as a person. I think there's a piece about creating that kind of psychological safety so that people are able to say, I don't get that, or I don't know, and it's a safe place to explore. And thirdly, I think there's a piece around, we're often challenged, and I'm sure you are, and a lot of the listeners are, about doing things really, really quickly and cutting down time to do it. And I think there's something around us as collectively as kind of facilitators and trainers to challenge and push back a bit and say, this is really important. And although it often gets pushed to one side and we want to get on with the doing, by giving people time, and it doesn't need to be long, but by giving them time and space to connect as people, can make a massive difference. And I think it speeds up that trust piece. I think it speeds up connection. I think that helps ultimately a relationship. And I think it really matters.
I think that is a great point on which to finish, Sarah. Thank you so much. Where can we find out more about you? Website, social media, that kind of thing?
So we are the Conversation Space, and there's lots about our whole methodology and approach of conversational wisdom on there, and at Convo Space on Twitter as well. And it would be lovely to hear other people's experiences and what has worked for them. And to continue helping to put conversations right at the heart of business.
Thank you so much.